The Appalachian Mountains, with their dense forests and deep valleys, are repositories of narratives as ancient as the very rock foundations of their steep slopes. It is within this isolated landscape that our tale commences, in McDowell County, West Virginia, circa 1923, a place where families, generation after generation, remained cut off from the external world for decades. The Hollister family resided in a small log cabin, positioned at the dead end of a route that became impassable during the severe winter. The cabin was so remote that the Hollisters saw no one but each other for 4 or 5 months of every year. This very isolation would establish the ideal backdrop for a tragedy spanning generations. Jeremiah Hollister was the family's patriarch, a tall, bony figure possessing a thick beard and piercing blue eyes. Widowed at the age of 42, he raised his daughter Martha single-handedly, a girl with delicate features. Martha's mother, Sarah, had succumbed during a difficult childbirth when the girl was only 6 years old. The infant, a boy, also did not survive. Since that time, father and daughter lived in solitude within that tiny cabin. The nearest neighbors were almost 10 kilometers distant, and visits were few and far between. The pastor from the small local church generally attempted to visit them once a year, usually in the summer. He observed that Martha, now 14, seemed increasingly reserved, avoiding direct eye contact and often holding her arms crossed across her body. Jeremiah was always an odd fellow, recounts Eleanina Davis, now 9'3" and one of the few remaining individuals who knew the Hollisters. Even before Sarah passed away, he rarely came into town. Sarah was the one who came for supplies, always hurrying, always looking over her shoulder as if afraid someone might be following her. Local community members commented on the unusual dynamic between the father and daughter. On the rare instances they appeared at the village grocery store together, Martha seemed like a mere shadow, always trailing her father by a step, responding with only monosyllables when someone attempted to strike up a conversation. The winter of 1937 proved particularly brutal in the mountains. It was during this specific winter that Martha, then 20 years old, conceived her first child. When spring finally arrived, Martha did not accompany her father down to the town. Whispers started circulating when Jeremiah was seen purchasing baby clothes at the grocery store. "My daughter is expecting," was his sole utterance, his face as impassive as the mountain stone. Suspicions intensified among the local populace. Martha hadn't been seen with any man, and no one was known to have climbed the mountain to court her. The community began to circulate increasingly dark theories. It was Dr. William Foster, the region's only physician, who was eventually summoned to the Hollister cabin on a rainy night in June 1938. Martha was in labor, and complications had compelled Jeremiah to seek assistance. What Dr. Foster encountered in that cabin would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Martha, frail and pale, gave birth to a girl whose facial characteristics instantly alerted the experienced doctor to the probability of consanguinity. The child was born exhibiting several traits characteristic of offspring resulting from closely related unions, heart defects, extra fingers, and a visibly underdeveloped jaw. She survived for only 3 days. Martha never named the child's father, but the doctor's suspicions were recorded in his diary, along with the unsettling observation that Jeremiah appeared more devastated by the infant's death than would be typical for a grandfather. He cradled her as though she were his own daughter, the doctor penned. He wept in a manner that forced me to avert my gaze, as if I were a witness to something too intimate, too sacred in its perversity. In those secluded mountains, where the law seldom reached, families marrying amongst themselves wasn't unheard of. Cousins wedded cousins, and uncles married nieces, all in an effort to retain land within the family. However, even within this context, certain boundaries were respected. The relationship between a father and his daughter was a taboo that few communities would tolerate. After the demise of Martha's first daughter, a hush fell over the Hollister cabin. For nearly a year, Martha was not seen by anyone in town. Jeremiah came down to acquire supplies alone, evading any attempts at conversation. In April 1939, Martha was expecting her second child. The child, a boy named Elijah, was delivered at home with the assistance of Ida Mae Jenkins, a local midwife, who was only called at the very last moment. That dwelling had an unusual odor, Ida Mae recounted years later. There was a scent that brought to mind a wounded animal, a smell of despair and resignation. And when I saw the baby, the reason became clear. The boy was born with several visible deformities. His fingers were fused, forming a claw-like shape, and his eyes were different colors, one blue, like Jeremiah's, the other brown, like Martha's. More alarming was the abnormally large size of his head, a sign of hydrocephalus. That child won't make it through the winter, Ida May informed Jeremiah, who received the news with a simple nod. Surprisingly, Elijah survived not only that winter but the subsequent 5 years. He never learned to articulate more than a few disconnected words, and his movement was restricted. Martha carried him everywhere, even after he became too large to do so. During these years, Martha conceived 2 more times. The third child, a girl named Ruth, was born with less pronounced deformities, but her mental development was clearly compromised. The fourth child, another boy, was stillborn in 1944 and was interred in the small family burial plot behind the cabin. That family consistently experienced issues with stillbirths or early infant deaths, explains Harlan Thompson, a local historian. Records indicate that the Hollisters first arrived in the mountains in the 1820s and, since then, have married almost exclusively among cousins. This pattern of consanguineous marriages resulted in a concentration of problematic genes that manifested in progressively more severe ways. In 1945, tragedy revisited the family when Elijah, then 6 years old, succumbed to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Martha was observed at the funeral, holding the hand of Ruth, who was then 4. Neighbors noticed that Martha appeared to be expecting once again. Martha's 5th child was born in June 1946, a girl named Sarah in honor of Martha's deceased mother. Unlike her older half-siblings, Sarah seemed relatively healthy. Her eyes were a deep blue, almost a mirror image of Jeremiah's, and her initial development seemed normal. Sarah's apparent normality ushered in a shift in Jeremiah's demeanor. He began bringing her along when he went to town, displaying her with a pride that local residents found unsettling. He treated her as though she were his own daughter, not his granddaughter, recalls Clementine Parker, who worked at the grocery store at the time. He was always showing off how intelligent she was, how quickly she learned, and the resemblance between them was undeniable, same eyes, same facial structure. As Sarah matured, it became evident that she had eluded the worst genetic consequences that afflicted her half-siblings. At 5, she sporadically attended the local school during the warmer months. The teacher, Miss Abigail Wilson, noted that despite some learning difficulties, Sarah was considerably more advanced than her sister Ruth. It was through Sarah that the outside world began to catch a glimpse of the true nature of life inside the Hollister cabin. On a rainy autumn day in 1952, Sarah arrived at school with a visible bruise on her face. When Miss Wilson questioned her, the girl finally spoke. "Daddy got cross because Mommy didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore," she stated with the disconcerting innocence of a child. "He says Mommy is his, that she's always been his since Grandma died." Miss Wilson reported the incident to Sheriff John Buchanan, but without concrete evidence beyond a child's testimony, he was reluctant to intervene. "Those mountain families operate by their own rules," the sheriff remarked. "It's not our place to interfere unless there is a clear and immediate danger." The winter of 1952 to 1953 further isolated the Hollister cabin. When spring finally arrived, Martha was seen in town with Ruth and Sarah, but she looked haggard and older than her 36 years. Most alarming was Jeremiah's absence. It wasn't until July 1953, when a hunter got lost in the mountains and passed near the Hollister property, that the truth came to light. The hunter, Joseph Miller, reported seeing a fresh grave in the small family cemetery. The rudimentary headstone bore the name Jeremiah Hollister and the date of his death, January 12, 1953. "I found it strange that no one in town knew he had passed," Miller told the sheriff. "But the oddest thing was what I observed through the cabin window. Martha was seated at the table with the 2 girls, and she seemed happy. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders." The summer of 1953 brought changes for the Hollister family. With Jeremiah's death, Martha appeared to have discovered a newfound freedom. She began visiting the town more often, started a small vegetable garden, and permitted Sarah to attend school regularly. Ruth, although still limited in her development, showed some improvement in her behavior. It was during this time that Martha met Jacob Wheeler, a middle-aged widower who had recently moved to the area. Jacob was a carpenter who had sought refuge in the mountains following his wife's passing. Unlike most local residents, he paid no heed to the rumors surrounding the Hollisters. Everyone has a history, he would say. What matters is the present and how we choose to move forward from here. The friendship between Martha and Jacob developed slowly, built on chance meetings at the grocery store and brief conversations following Sunday church services. For a woman who had spent her entire existence under the oppressive control of her father, Jacob's simple kindness felt like water in a desert. In October 1953, Jacob formally sought permission to court Martha. The community reacted with a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. How could a decent man like Jacob show interest in a woman with Martha's past? But in small communities, secrets are rarely kept buried forever. One Sunday afternoon after church, Clementine Parker approached Jacob in the parking lot. "Do you know who the father of those girls is?" she inquired, her voice low but heavy with insinuation. Jacob, uncomfortable with the question, replied that he assumed the father was Martha's deceased husband. Clementine let out a dry laugh. "Martha was never married, Jacob. Those girls, their father is the same man who was Martha's father. Jeremiah Hollister kept his own daughter. As you can surely understand what I'm saying. You're getting involved with a family that's cursed." The revelation struck Jacob like a physical blow. He drove aimlessly along the winding mountain roads for hours, attempting to process what he had just been told. When he finally returned to town, night had already fallen. He drove to the Hollister cabin. Martha was sitting on the porch, as if she had been waiting for him. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm and resigned. Jacob simply nodded, unable to articulate any words. "I understand if you never wish to see me again," Martha continued. "But before you depart, I would like you to hear my side of the story." And so, beneath the starry sky of the Appalachian Mountains, Martha Hollister narrated her story. She described how her father had begun to abuse her shortly after her mother's death. How, at 14, she had once attempted to run away, only to be caught and dragged back to the cabin, where Jeremiah had chained her to the foot of the bed for weeks as punishment. How, over the years, she had become pregnant multiple times, giving birth to children who bore the genetic burden of that forbidden union. "I loved them, you know," she whispered, silent tears streaming down her face, despite how they were conceived, despite the deformities, despite everything. "They were my babies. I simply wanted to shield them, to afford them some chance at life." Jacob listened in silence, his heart torn between horror at the narrative he was hearing and growing compassion for the woman before him, who had endured more than any person should. "And Jeremiah," he finally inquired, "how did he die?" Martha gazed up at the starry sky for a long moment before responding. "The winter was harsh," she finally said. "He became ill. Pneumonia, most likely. He refused to go down the mountain to see the doctor. One day, he simply didn't wake up." There was something in her tone, an almost imperceptible hesitation, that led Jacob to question if he was being told the absolute truth. But who was he to judge this woman, considering all she had lived through? "The day he died," Martha continued, "I felt like I could breathe freely for the first time in decades. It's a terrible thing to say about your own father, I realize, but it was as if a shadow had been lifted, not just from me, but from the girls too." Jacob took Martha's hands in his, a simple gesture of compassion that caused her eyes to fill with tears again. "No one should have to go through what you endured," he stated. "No one." At that precise moment, Sarah appeared in the cabin doorway, her blue eyes, Jeremiah's eyes, wide in the darkness. "Mommy," she called out, her voice small and tentative. Martha turned to her daughter. "It's all right, darling. Mr. Wheeler and I are simply talking. Go back to bed." Sarah hesitated, looking cautiously at Jacob before complying and retreating inside the cabin. "She resembles him," Martha said softly. "Sometimes when I look at her, I see him looking back at me, and my heart momentarily freezes." but then she smiles or says something sweet, and I remember that she is not him. She is her own person, despite everything. The following months established an almost normal routine at the Hollister cabin. Jacob visited regularly, assisting with repairs to the property and bringing small gifts for the girls. The transformation in Martha was remarkable. The woman who once avoided eye contact and flinched at the slightest sound now occasionally smiled. The relationship between Jacob and Martha became the primary subject of local gossip. "It's unnatural," commented Abigail Simmons, one of the local matriarchs. "A respectable man like Jacob getting involved with, well, we all know what she is." "She is not to blame for anything," countered Eleanina Davis. "She was a victim, not a wrongdo. And those girls are innocent of any sin committed by their parents." Meanwhile, in the mountain cabin, Martha battled her own internal demons. At night, after the girls were asleep, nightmares frequently awakened her, sweaty and shaking, the ghost of Jeremiah still powerfully present in her mind. "Sometimes I think I catch a glimpse of him," she confessed to Jacob, standing in the room's corner or at the edge of the forest. "I know it's not real, but it feels so real." Jacob gently proposed that she might benefit from talking to someone. Martha initially resisted the idea, fearing exposure and judgment. However, when the nightmares began to affect her daily well-being, she finally agreed. Dr. Richard Montgomery, a psychiatrist who visited the larger town once a month, became an unexpected ally. A progressive individual for his era, he had studied the effects of prolonged trauma and understood that Martha's behavior stemmed not from a moral deficiency, but rather as a natural response to years of abuse. With his support, Martha slowly began to process her trauma. It was a painful journey, marked by relapses and moments of despair, yet also by small victories and glimpses of hope. Concurrently, Sarah, now 7 years old, flourished in school. Her natural intelligence, combined with a fierce desire to learn, compensated for the occasional difficulties she faced due to her genetics. Ruth, though never capable of a completely independent life, developed surprising skill in sewing and crafts. But as the girls grew, inevitable questions arose. Sarah, in particular, began to ask about her father. "Why don't I have a father like the other kids?" she asked Martha one night. Martha froze, the glass of water in her hand trembling slightly. How does one explain something so complex and distressing to a child? "Your grandfather Jeremiah took care of us after your father left," Martha finally said, choosing her words with great care. It was not strictly a lie, but it omitted the darker truth. "And where did my father go?" Sarah persisted. He wasn't ready to be a father," Martha replied, feeling the words inadequate as soon as they were spoken. Sarah, with the insight of children, realized there was more to the story than her mother was willing to share. But, like many children in complicated family situations, she learned not to press certain issues. In 1956, 3 years following Jeremiah's death, Jacob proposed marriage to Martha. It was a simple proposal, delivered during a picnic in a sunny clearing near the cabin. Martha, taken by surprise, did not immediately answer. "Are you certain?" she finally asked. "After everything you know about me, about my past." Jacob took her hands in his. "I know you, Martha. Not just your past, but the woman you are now. A survivor. A mother who would do anything for her daughters. A woman who possesses more strength than anyone I've ever encountered." Martha looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know if I'll ever truly be a normal, if I'll ever be able to be the wife you deserve." "I am not asking you to be something you are not," Jacob replied gently. "I am asking that we build a future together, at our own pace, in our own way." The wedding was a small event, held in the cabin itself with only a few guests present. Life as Mrs. Wheeler brought a new sense of legitimacy to Martha within the community. For Sarah and Ruth, Jacob became the father figure they never had, patient, gentle, and encouraging. But the past possesses a way of resurfacing when least anticipated. In 1959, when Sarah was 13 years old, the same age Martha was when Jeremiah's abuse began, she discovered an old diary hidden in a box in the cabin's attic. It was her mother's journal, started shortly after her grandmother Sarah's death. The yellowed pages contained the raw truth that had been meticulously concealed from her, the true nature of her birth, the fact that her grandfather was also her father, the deaths of her older half-siblings due to genetic deformities caused by consanguinity, and her mother's years of silent agony. When Martha found Sarah seated on the bed, the diary open in her lap and silent tears running down her face, she instantly understood what had transpired. A chill spread through her, followed by a wave of nausea so intense she had to lean against the door to keep from falling. "Is it true?" Sarah asked, her voice small and broken. "Grandpa Jeremiah was my father." Martha closed her eyes, as if she could shut out the reality of the situation. But when she opened them again, her daughter was still there, waiting for an answer that would change her life forever. "Yes," Martha finally uttered, the word escaping like a painful sigh. "Yes, it is true." The revelation of the truth to Sarah shook the foundations of the Wheeler-Hollister family. The teenager became withdrawn and silent. She stopped attending school for several weeks, fearing that her classmates might somehow see the mark of her origin on her face. "I'm a freak," she told Martha during a difficult confrontation. "Half of my genes originate from the same source." "Is that why Ruth is the way she is? Is that why my other siblings died? And what is wrong with me that we haven't found yet?" Martha, devastated by her daughter's pain but resolute in no longer hiding behind falsehoods, explained everything: the genetic risks of consanguinity, why some children are more affected than others, and the fact that Sarah appeared to have escaped the worst physical consequences. "But that doesn't mean I'm all right," Sarah countered. "What if I have children someday? Will they inherit this contamination?" It was Jacob who suggested they consult a specialist in genetics. Dr. Benjamin Rosen, a Jewish doctor working at a university in Philadelphia, was known for his pioneering work in human genetics. After exchanging correspondence with him, the family made the long trip to Pennsylvania for a consultation. "You are not a freak, my dear," he told her after conducting several examinations. "You are a young woman who had the misfortune to be born under difficult circumstances, but that fact does not define who you are or who you can become." He explained to Sarah how genetics works, how everyone carries potentially problematic recessive genes, but these genes usually only cause problems if they are paired with similar genes from the other parent. If you marry someone with no genetic relation to your family, your children will likely be as healthy as any other child, he assured her. The key point is that your future partner has no connection to the Hollister lineage. The consultation with Dr. Rosen marked a turning point for Sarah. While the truth about her origins remained painful, she began to separate that truth from her personal identity. She was not merely the daughter of incest. She was Sarah Wheeler, having officially adopted Jacob's surname, a young woman with her own possibilities and dreams. Life in the mountain cabin slowly achieved a new equilibrium. Ruth, now 18 years old, continued to develop her talent for crafts. Her tapestries and quilts began to earn recognition beyond the local community. In 1962, Sarah, at 16, met Michael Prescott, the son of a university professor who had moved to the region to study Appalachian culture and music. Michael quickly became her friend, and eventually, her first love. When Sarah finally gathered the courage to tell Michael her family history, fearing his rejection, he surprised her with his response. "My father is Jewish," he said. "My grandparents fled the pogroms in Russia. I understand what it is like to carry the weight of family history, Sarah. I know what it's like to be judged not for who you are, but for what others think you represent." The romance between Sarah and Michael blossomed. When Sarah was awarded a scholarship to study nursing at West Virginia University, an extraordinary achievement for a young woman of her background, Michael supported her decision. Martha watched her daughter's progress with a mix of pride and amazement. Sarah was forging a path that she herself had never had the chance to contemplate: higher education, a career, the liberty to choose her own partner and determine her own future. In 1965, while Sarah was in her final year of nursing school, she and Michael were married in a small ceremony in the university chapel. Martha, dressed in a light blue outfit, had never looked so radiant as she did at the moment she watched her daughter walk down the aisle toward a future she could never have envisioned for herself. That same year, Dr. Montgomery suggested that Martha consider sharing her story more widely. The field of psychology was beginning to acknowledge the prevalence and impact of child abuse and incest, subjects that were previously almost entirely taboo. Your experience, told anonymously, could help professionals better understand how to identify and assist victims, he explained. And perhaps more crucially, it could help other women and girls in similar situations know that they are not alone. After months of careful thought and discussions with Jacob and her daughters, Martha agreed to be interviewed for an academic study on survivors of prolonged family abuse. Her case, published under the pseudonym Patient H, became one of the most frequently cited in the emerging literature on trauma and resilience. In 1970, Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 29. Heart complications, likely related to her genetics, led to silent heart failure. She died surrounded by her creations, quilts, tapestries, and embroideries that told stories in fabric when she could not express them in words. Sarah, now a respected nurse and mother of 2 healthy children, Elizabeth and James, returned for the funeral with Michael and the children. It was the first time that Elizabeth, 5, and James, 3, visited the mountain cabin where their mother had grown up.